But I began to see that the New Testament was actually trustworthy. That, in fact, today it says what it has always said. I could come up with no model of uniform corruption for the New Testament. The New Testament was spread so rapidly throughout that area that in order for it to get uniformly corrupted, someone would have to recollect all the books of the New Testament, change it, and then redistribute it. And there was just no one in a position to do that at that time, no one at all. In fact, when the books were going around for the most part, to even gather as Christians was a crime under the Diocletian Edict. So I could see no way, no model. And it's easy enough to say, they corrupted the New Testament. Okay, give me some details. How did they corrupt the New Testament? Well, they got together. When did they get together? There was no model to do that. So after a year, I said, okay, the New Testament, trustworthy. But still, inside it, nowhere does Jesus say he is God. Quite the opposite. Jesus makes it very clear he's a man and a prophet. And David and I went into that issue head first. Now, for me today, my ministry, Creed 2.6, which Dave was talking about earlier, is centered around Jesus. Who is he? What was he to the earliest Christians? What does that mean for us today? As believers, for those of you who have parents who are believers or have been raised in a believing environment, that's a great, great thing. But one of the downfalls to that is that you are often unable to catch just how radical and how awe-inspiring the incarnation is. That God would become a man, incomprehensible. Why in the world would he do that? How much did he have to give up? What was more humiliating to him, dying naked on the cross or becoming a man to begin with? Hard to wrestle with. And so, as a Muslim, I was taught that God would never compromise his majesty, his lordship, in such a manner as to become the son of carpenter. Quit your sniggering. The son of a carpenter and of a young girl. How would God do that? And not just to be born in that fashion, but then to live in labor his whole life, and then at some point to have to be betrayed by friends and to die on the cross? That makes no sense at all to a Muslim. Makes zero sense. In fact, it's so obviously wrong to a Muslim just because of the degree of humiliation God has to undergo. And so, to me, the biggest issue is Jesus. He is the issue to deal with. And you'll see that coming out today in my talks, and we have a whole session on Jesus as the pivot point. But just to give you a brief intro at this point, I looked at my friend David and I said, can we know that Jesus claimed to be God? Did he? I don't think so. He doesn't do it in the New Testament. And so we started looking, and the first place anyone goes in order to defend the deity of Christ is the Gospel of John. First place to go, the easiest place. You see things from John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, the whole prologue to John, very clear. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Nothing that was created in this world was created except through the Word. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory. The glories of the only begotten of God. And the Word is in fact the only begotten God, according to verse 18. Okay, so I'm looking at this as a Muslim. What am I going to say? What's my response going to be? Is this Jesus talking? No. Right? Is this Jesus talking? John 1? No. This is the prologue. This is John the author. Who's this? Do we know who he is? That's a tough question. When was John's gospel written? Very good. So the skeptical scholars will generally say 80 to 100. Some conservative scholars will put it as early as 70. Some scholars, like Daniel Wallace of Dallas Theological, puts it in the 50s. But the average scholar doesn't put it anywhere before the 80s and as late as 95 to 100 AD. Whoa, so you're telling me the first person to say Jesus was God was 70 years after he was crucified? No, I want to see it earlier. This is what I'm saying as a Muslim. I want to see it earlier. By the way, the arguments I'm giving you right now are from my Muslim perspective. We're going to have a much clearer version of all this stuff, so don't get confused. So as a Muslim, I'm saying I want to see the deity of Christ earlier in the Gospels. In fact, I want to see it at the earliest level. So, what's the first Gospel? Mark. Cool. When was it written? 40, 70, what else do we hear? Can I get a 50? Can I get 55, 55, 60, 65? Okay, you have various views on when Mark was written. The ending of Mark, some people say, is written as early as the 30s or 40s. But in general, skeptical scholars do not put Mark before 70 AD. All right? So that's about the skeptical dating, 70 AD. And when I'm saying skeptical, I'm saying non-conservative Christian. So the average scholar who's not a conservative Christian would put it around 70 AD. Okay, first gospel. I want to see Jesus say that he is God in the Gospel of Mark. Because if it's not in the first gospel, that means it was probably invented somewhere between the first and the fourth gospel. Because why in the world would a gospel author, called an evangelist, why would an evangelist leave out the fact that Jesus claimed to be God? Does that make sense? We'd want to see it in the earliest gospel. And this is how I'm coming at it as a Muslim. And I said, I got to see this. Where does Jesus claim to be God? And so I started studying Mark with as much vigor as I could, coming from a total layman perspective. I mean, I was still a pre-med student at the time. And what I came to realize was when you read Mark's gospel through the correct lens, and that lens being a person who understands Jewish thought from the first century, then you begin to see what Mark is saying about Jesus. We'll go into more depth in a little bit, but what I want to tell you is that Mark 14:62 is Jesus' response to the Sanhedrin, specifically to the high priest in the Gospel of Mark. And the high priest is the person who is presiding over Israel. And here he asks Jesus, he demands of Jesus that Jesus say who he is. And what do we know from Romans 13? Talked about it yesterday, that the Lord has put authorities on top of us on this earth, and we're to listen to them. And if there was anyone who could demand that Jesus say who he is as a Jew, it would be the high priest. And Jesus, at that moment, makes it abundantly clear who he is. He makes it so clear that in verse 64, what does the high priest do? Tears open his robes, which isn't like him going, ugh. It's like, ah! Like, Hulk Hogan style, WrestleMania, kind of rip it off. I've just heard blasphemy in my presence. This guy has just said something about his own identity that compromises the identity of the one true God. What do you all say about him? And they say, crucify him. Right? So whatever Jesus says in 14:62 and 63 is extremely powerful. And I, as a Muslim, took a look at that, and I realized when I decoded exactly what it meant, through some excellent works. Josh McDowell's work really helped at that point. Lee Strobel had just written his book on the case for Christ. Very good stuff. Introductory apologetic stuff. I realized, okay, clearly Jesus claims to be God.